Yes, Andre, can you tell us a bit about yourself and who you are and where you come from and your involvement in the New York Islanders, please?
Sure, sure. So I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. I migrated to the U.S. Back in 1988 um, after playing youth hockey back in Trinidad, um, and joined the Islanders on my arrival here. At that time, uh, the club was originally two separate and distinct clubs. So when I first came in, I joined the New York Field Hockey Club, which was a club originally formed by some German expats back in 1938. Um, the club eventually was infiltrated by some Trinidadians that migrated in the 60s. One in particular is Harold Cox, who was a former Trinidad national who played for Trinidad in the Pan Am Games when Trinidad won the silver medal in the 60s. There were some other expats as well from Trinidad, Squeaky Hines and a few others. Um, with the with more migration in the 70s, people like my father, Owen Ferguson, and my uncle, Rupert Ferguson, also played with the club during the 70s and 80s during their times coming to and from the US and Trinidad. So when I joined the club, New York Field Hockey was a really established club in what was NEFA, Northeast Field Hockey Association, which at that time had two divisions with probably about 14 to 16 clubs, primarily men. There was no women's league. Um, each team had its own home venue, and New York Field Hockey Club was based in Westchester, um, at a college called Manhattanville College in Westchester. And we would play our home games there, and we would play the other teams. Some of the other teams at that time was Greenwich Field Hockey Club, which was primarily English expats. There was New Jersey Field Hockey Club. There was Rye Field Hockey Club, again, another German, English expats. Then there were a couple teams from Pakistan. Um, so there was a lot of hockey to play, and at that time we played a combination of turf, grass, but primarily turf. Um, and then over the years, as we had individuals come and go from the club, there was a decline in membership. So at that time, we had a really solid club, and we actually won the league at that point. We had limited numbers, but we had some really good players at the time. In fact, our main player at the time was Raul Cox, who played for the U.S. in the '84 Olympics.
So
And we had,
is this still
sorry,
part of, is this still part of the original New York team?
this is part of the original New York Field Hockey Club.
Okay.
Yeah, Raul Cox, who was the son of Harold Cox, one of the original Trinidadians of the club. Raul played for quite a long time for the U.S. Raul's brothers also were part of the club, and they were really active within the club. In fact, he had uh, Keith Cox, who's deceased at this point. He was also a member of the U.S. team. Larry Cox, who also played for the U.S. at the youth level and at the national level. And then their other brother, Keith, who was a big part of the club but didn't play for or didn't represent the U.S. at that time. We also had a few other expats from Guyana, primarily Jeremy Roberts, Brian Hope, Ian Nicholson, that all joined New York Field Hockey Club at that point in time.
So,
And
when you all turned up at New York Field Hockey Club, who were the original members? Who were the pre-existing club members?
So the Cox family was a really big part to the club at that point in time. So you had four members of the Cox family actively playing. Harold Cox, who was alive at that time, was around, but he wasn't actively playing. Then their uncle was a part of the. He was the manager and the stalwart that held the club together at that point in time. His name was Ozzy Elborn, who has since migrated back to Trinidad. But he was the main glue for the club through the early years that I arrived in '88 through the early '90s.
Am I right in thinking that there was in the original pre-existing New York team that there was a Germanic influence?
Yes, the original team was basically, it was mostly Germans. By the time I arrived in '88, there was only one that was still around the club at that point. At that time, in fact, in '88 we celebrated the club's 50th anniversary, and we had a tournament. That was my first introduction to the team, actually. And he was around. Yeah, if you ask me his name right now, I'm drawing a blank. He was just the only member, I think, still around and still able to show up. But at that point, obviously, he wasn't playing anymore.
So the original New York team would have started then in 1938.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. 1938 was the original formation of the club.
When was the change? How did the change from the original New York Field Hockey Club start to move towards the New York Islanders?
So New York Islanders, Islanders at the time, was a club that was primarily made up of expats from Barbados and Trinidad, and they started in the '70s, and they were part of the league along with New York Islanders, as two separate distinct clubs. And we had our internal rivalry, of course, as being two heavily West Indian teams. In the '90s, as I was explaining before, both teams were undergoing some challenges in terms of membership and getting enough people to play. So Islanders at the time was the club who actually started to introduce women into the concept of playing in the league, because up to that point there was no women's league. The women that did play all were part of the Islanders team, and Islanders played with a mixed concept. So as we both had challenges for numbers, Nigel Travosa, who was originally a member of Islanders, had come over to New York during that time when he was playing for the U.S. national team for the '96 Olympics. And through his influence of having relationships on both sides, he was, I would say, instrumental in orchestrating the merger of the teams, because he was the one person that had that relationships on both sides, because he was a long-standing member of Islanders, and at that time joined New York and was with New York for like 2 years up to that point. So as both teams were struggling, sorry.
That's all right. So I spoke to Euclid Mahon a few days ago.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like he was part of the original Islanders team.
Correct.
And you were part of the New York team, which was different at the time, but you both there
Yes.
doing the amalgamation.
Yes. So we were part of, and the way how we started doing it, there was one major tournament in New York at the time, which was the Port Jervis tournament, which was run by the New Jersey Field Hockey Club. And that tournament was the premier tournament in the U.S. at the time. And we experimented with the merger in that tournament. That was the first time we did it, and it would turn out to be really successful. In fact, we won the tournament with the merger of the two teams. So we decided to explore it some more. And that's when we, in '96, '97 is when we started down the road of merging the two teams. At that point, Euclid was the president of Islanders. Our president at the time was a gentleman called Wayne Spear Bartholomew. I was the captain of the team at the time. So there was a committee that was put together, and we had a meeting of the minds, and eventually went the way of merging the two teams.